Hello, I'm Tom Kimmel. My story today will explore new information as to whether or not war with Japan was considered a backdoor opportunity for war with Germany, and if so, by whom? I'll do my best to tell the story chronologically and start with information unknown to any of the 10 official investigations of the Pearl Harbor attack.
Roy the other day received, Roy Nolan, a telegram, as I remember, from the chief of the Japanese Press Association in which said these damage that everybody is privileged because money still a bad feeling of something in this country. Read its full of figures to Jack Columbus. I mean, it won't stand there nonsense. In this country from the Jack, if they do some sort of thing. Well, this next novel fellow wires to Roy and says, "These are war with the United States important memory on one condition, and one condition only. That is, that the United States will recognize the new era in not the Far East, but the East, meaning the Holocaust. Furthermore, that this recognition, there must be evidence of it. And the only evidence of this recognition the United States can give is to demilitarize all of its naval and air and armor bases in Wake, Midway, and Pearl Harbor. Crowd back any damn Jack told us to get out of the way. The Germans after Jack going along with Jack. Last 6 years, without the subscription, without the Mississippi, down last day. And the time babies coming in the game, some two things.
This was also unknown to any Pearl Harbor investigation. Eleanor Roosevelt gave President Roosevelt a letter anonymously written to her from the American white wife of a Japanese. In it, she said, in pertinent part, the Japanese are planning to strike the Hawaiians and Philippines at the first available opportunity. Be on your guard. President Roosevelt told his aide, Pa Watson, to take this up with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover in person. This was also unknown to any Pearl Harbor investigation. Arthur McCallum was the head of the Far East section of the Office of Naval Intelligence. He wrote a memorandum, an action proposal, on October 7, 1940, in which he proposed 8 actions designed to provoke Japan into an overt act of war. 7 actions were executed. Of course, Admiral Kimmel was not advised of the proposal, nor was the Joint Congressional Committee. As a matter of fact, this action proposal was not even discovered until 1995. Here are the 8 actions that McCallum said needed because it was not believed that the United States at the time was capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado. Therefore, the following course of action is suggested. And he listed 8 actions and said that if by these 8 actions Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. 7 of these 8 listed action items were indeed implemented. Number 4 on the graphic actually was contemplated at least twice, but not executed. Obviously, McCallum wanted to keep his action memorandum secret from investigators. At the Joint Congressional Committee, Senator Lucas asked Admiral McCallum, who of course was under oath, "Do you know of anyone in your branch of the service or any other department of the Navy who attempted to trick or maneuver the Japanese into attacking the United States on December 7, 1941? McCallum: "No, sir." Senator Barkley followed that up with the pervasive question, which should be asked to all witnesses. "The chair would like to ask you, Admiral McCallum, if there is any other information you have that is pertinent to this inquiry that has not been brought out by the questions asked." McCallum's response: "No, sir, I don't think so, Senator." Admiral J.R. Richardson said he told President Roosevelt on October 8, 1941, that our fleet in Pearl Harbor is disadvantageously disposed for preparing for or initiating war operations. Admiral Richardson's strident views led to his firing by President Roosevelt and replacement by Admiral Kimmel. Admiral Richardson later wrote that he thought that President Roosevelt was willing for some ship of the Navy to be the victim of a Japanese mistake. Here's what else Admiral Richardson said.
Admiral Kimmel takes the witness stand. He reports on a conversation with the late President Roosevelt on October 8, 1940, 14 months before Pearl Harbor. Later, I asked the President if we were going to enter the room. He replied that if the Japanese attack Thailand, the Small Peninsula, or the Great East Indies, we would not enter the room. That even if they attacked the Philippines, he doubted we would enter the room. But that they could not always avoid making mistakes. And that as the war continued and the area of operations expanded, sooner or later they would make a mistake and we would enter the room. 4 years after, the nation hears the story behind Pearl Harbor.
3 weeks later, President Roosevelt gave his famous Boston speech. Robert Sherwood, who helped prepare the speech, had some qualms of conscience in later years. It was a mistake for President Roosevelt to yield to sweeping reassurance. But unfortunately, for my own conscience, I happened at the time to be one of those who urged him to go the limit. I burn inwardly whenever I think of those words again and again and again.
I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Our boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
Regarding President Roosevelt's love of the Navy, and attitude toward peacetime naval ship and personnel losses, President Roosevelt contemplated at least 3 times risking warships and personnel to warn Japan. Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, wrote a memorandum in which he said to the President, in which he said, in pertinent part, "Since your thought yesterday, President Roosevelt, of the possibility of sending a detachment to the Philippines consisting of approximately 4 cruisers, 9 destroyers and carriers, and perhaps to permit a leak to the Japanese, I recall your remark in a previous conference when Secretary of State Cordell Hull suggested this, and the question arose as to getting them out there. And your reply was that you might not mind losing 1 or 2 cruisers, but that you did not want to risk taking a chance of losing 5 or 6. Here, twice, was President Roosevelt risking personnel and warships. And then again, on December 1st, 1941, with his 3 small schemes, he did it for a 3rd time. I'll get to that shortly. An ultimatum is a final statement of terms made by one party to another. A statement, especially in diplomatic negotiations, that expresses or implies the threat of serious penalties if the terms are not accepted. The striking fact is that the United States gave Japan 5 warnings or ultimatums, and that all these statements promised Japan war with the United States if the Japanese attacked territory not belonging to the United States. The first warning, listed before you, warns Japan against moves on British territory. The second warns Japan against moves on Dutch and British territory. The third warns Japan against moves on French territory. Number 4 warns Japan against moves again on British territory. And number 5 warns Japan against moves on Chinese territory. Counselor of Embassy in Japan, Eugene Duman, to Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chuichi Ohashi, on February 14, 1941, warns Japan against moves on British territory. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, in a memorandum to the President on June 23, 1941, offered this: there might develop from the embargoing of oil to Japan such a situation as would make it not only possible but easy to get in this war in an effective way. And if we should thus indirectly be brought in, we would avoid the criticism that we had gone in as an ally of communistic Russia. Second warning to Japan. July 20th, 1941, Admiral Turner, the head of Naval War Plans, before the Joint Congressional Committee. I told Ambassador Nomura, the Japanese ambassador in Washington, D.C., that I believed that the United States would declare war against Japan if they went against the British in Singapore. Senator Ferguson asked, does your July 20th, 1941 message and President Roosevelt's August 17th, 1941 message to Ambassador Nomura amount to the same thing? Admiral Turner, yes, sir, I think so. Very close. The second warning warns Japan against moves on British and Dutch territory. At the request of Mr. Lauchlan Curie, Soviet spy and administrative assistant to the President of the United States, the Joint Military Board has made recommendations for furnishing aircraft to the Chinese government under the Lend-Lease Act. It's signed OK, FDR. Lauchlan Curie was identified as a Soviet spy by Elizabeth Bentley, another Soviet spy, and Soviet spy Whittaker Chambers, and by Venona, which was a code word for the secret American decoding of Soviet spy communications from Washington, D.C. and elsewhere to Moscow Center, prior to and during World War II. Curie was also identified as a Soviet spy by KGB archives. Here's what Barbara Walters had to say about all that.
Good evening, I'm Hugh Downs.
And I'm Barbara Walters, and this is 2020. It's a Pearl Harbor anniversary story you probably won't see anywhere else. The intriguing possibility that in launching a sneak attack, Japan did to us what we might well have done to them. Tonight you'll hear the details of a secret plan approved at the highest levels of the U.S. government.
This plan seems signed and approved by FDR himself on July 23rd, 1941, nearly 5 months before Pearl Harbor.
I certainly didn't know that there were plans for strategic bombing of Japan before Pearl Harbor.
No one knew about the bombing plans.
That was secret. All the supplies were secret. I mean, what we were sending is not a matter of public knowledge.
No question about it. And your mission was to take them on?
Yes, yes. Certainly, order of priority was one, seize control of the air over China. Keep China in the war.
When you were recruiting men for the American volunteers that summer, 1941, what was the strategic operation?
Well, to kill as many damn Japanese as we could. It's simple.
U.S. government knew about this. Helped develop this plan.
Not only knew about it, but they were 100% behind it. Where do you think the $50 million came from? The United States. It was secret. Nobody was supposed to talk about it. We did a damn good job of keeping it secret.
Clear Chenault wanted to bomb Japan, didn't he?
Yes, very much so.
You were an enthusiastic supporter of Chenault's plan.
Oh, yes. And I helped in every way I could.
To push the plan through, to see that it was executed.
Oh, yeah, the whole project, yes.
The third warning to Japan on July 23, 1941, again warns Japan against moves on French territory. The lead story in the New York Times on July 26, 1941, was that President Roosevelt tonight froze all Japanese assets in the United States, thus virtually severing trade ties with the empire and dealing it the most drastic blow short of actual war. This purple magic intercept was unknown to any Pearl Harbor investigation. August 14, 1941. From Japanese ambassador to Germany in Berlin, Baron Oshima, to Tokyo. On the 9th, when I called on Dai to discuss some other matter, Dai said that he had been at the general headquarters until the previous day, and that when the question of the United States came up in the course of a conversation, Hitler had said that if a clash occurs by any chance between Japan and the United States, Germany will at once open war against the United States. In view of the fact that my meeting with Dai was not a prearranged one, I don't believe this conversation was premeditated. It's important to note that this purple magic dispatch was not available in the Congressional Record Attack volumes and was not made public until 1978. Incidentally, Dai is Joseph Sepp Dietrich, Hitler's driver and a general in the Waffen SS. This was unknown to any Pearl Harbor investigation. It is British magic and contains the annotations of Winston Churchill himself in red and Stuart Menzies, the head of MI6, in green. When seeing Dietrich on the 9th on other business, he told me he had been at General Headquarters until the previous day and had just returned to Berlin. While talking about the question of America, he said that Hitler had declared that in the event of a collision between Japan and the United States, Germany would at once open hostilities with America. And of course, the very interesting part of this exchange is the annotation of Winston Churchill, his question to his head of MI6, Stuart Menzies. In view of the fact that the Americans themselves gave us the key to the Japanese messages, it seems probable the President knows this. President Roosevelt, that is, knows this already. But anyhow, it is very desirable he did know it. Propose me action. And Stuart Menzies does, with his comment, the Americans have had this message, C, which is a code word for the head of MI6, Stuart Menzies. Of course, this prompts the question, why was Winston Churchill so desirous of ensuring that President Roosevelt knew of this magic intercept? Interestingly enough, the phrase backdoor to war was used, maybe for the first time and the only time, in a magic intercept on August 16th, 1941, and was done so by the Japanese, indeed by Ambassador Nomura in Washington, D.C., in this purple magic dispatch to Tokyo, and Prime Minister Toyota, in pertinent part. I, Ambassador Nomura, understand that the British believe that if they could only have a Japanese-American war started at the back door, there would be a good prospect of getting the United States to participate in the European war. On August 9, 1941, Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt met on the USS Augusta in Placentia Bay and formed the Atlantic Charter. Captain Sherman, the United States Naval Liaison with the State Department, in minutes of the joint board meeting of November 3, 1941, pointed out that on August 17, 1941, following the President's return from the meeting at sea with Mr. Churchill, the President had issued an ultimatum to Japan that it would be necessary for the United States to take action in case of further Japanese aggression. FDR again warned Japan against moves on British territory, but this time he did it in person. Secretary of the Interior Ickes, writing in his diary, October 18, 1941, had this to say: "For a long time, I have believed that our best entrance into the war would be by way of Japan. And of course, if we go to war against Japan, it will inevitably lead us to war against Germany." Attorney General Francis Biddle's notes on a November 7, 1941 cabinet meeting. President Roosevelt asked Biddle and others if the United States should wait for an incident to attack Japan if they crossed the Pacific beyond a given line. Biddle responded, "The action would be popular because everyone would think of this as a naval warfare, excluding the possibility of an expeditionary force." Now, maybe not everybody, as you'll soon see. From Secretary of War Henry Stimson's diary concerning that November 41 cabinet meeting. President Roosevelt conducted a general poll of his cabinet on the question of whether the people would back us up in case we struck at Japan and what the tactics should be. Little noticed and outlined in red on the graphic was Secretary Stimson's comment, which didn't mean too much at the time, but means plenty today. The thing, meaning President Roosevelt's poll, would have been much stronger if the cabinet had known, and they did not know, except in the case of Secretary of State Cordell Hull and the President, what the Army is doing with the big bombers and how ready we are to pitch in. Much more on that in a moment. On November 13, 1941, the Coordinator of Information, Wild Bill Donovan, in a memo to President Roosevelt. The following is the substance of statements made by our spy, Dr. Hans Thomson, who was the German ambassador in Washington, D.C., on Thursday afternoon, November 6th, to Malcolm R. Lovell, Donovan's first asset. If Japan goes to war with the United States, Germany will immediately follow suit. This remarkable information was not known to any Pearl Harbor investigation. Historian Hanson Baldwin, in his 1950 book, Great Mistakes of the War, summed up reporters' accounts of General Marshall's secret meeting with them on November 15th, 1941, 22 days before the Pearl Harbor attack, without identifying General Marshall as the meeting's spokesman, styling it as a profound catalog of error. Again, this meeting was unknown to any Pearl Harbor investigation. 22 days before the Pearl Harbor attack, General Marshall identified as the spokesman only. We were on the brink of war with Japan. If a Pacific War started, there would not be much need for our Navy. The U.S. bombers could do the trick virtually single-handed, or to paraphrase the spokesman's words, without the use of our shipping. Our own Pacific Fleet would stay out of the range of Japanese air power in Hawaii. General Marshall's secret briefing to members of the press, November 15, 1941. General Marshall secretly briefed 7 members of the press on U.S. relations with Japan. 2 members, Robert Sherrod of Time magazine and Ernest Lindley of Newsweek magazine, memorialized the event. Sherrod, that day, in a memorandum, quoting and paraphrasing General Marshall. According to the memo, Marshall said, "Under great secrecy, we are building up our strength in the Philippines to a far higher level than the Japanese imagine. We are preparing an offensive war against Japan, whereas the Japanese reports show that we are preparing only to defend the Philippines. If war with Japan does come, we'll fight mercilessly. Flying fortresses will be dispatched immediately to set the paper cities of Japan on fire. There won't be any hesitation about bombing civilians. This information will be allowed to leak to the Japanese privately. If it got out publicly, Japan would be in a position to demand war immediately, before we were better fortified." Sherrod publicly attributed this quote to Marshall in 1964 for the first time. So, what was Marshall doing? Was Marshall trying to intimidate Japan or provoke her? Was he trying to bluff Japan? Was the unintended consequence forcing or reinforcing Japan's decision for war before the United States was better fortified? At any rate, General Marshall testified before the Joint Congressional Committee that he saw President Roosevelt on November 15, 1941. But he never testified about his secret meeting with reporters that day. President Roosevelt, at a War Cabinet meeting on November 25, 1941, as per Secretary of War Stimson's diary. President Roosevelt: "We were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday, December 1st, 1941. So the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning, and the question was, what should we do?" Secretary of War Stimson's diary continued for that day, November 25th, 1941. The question was how we should maneuver the Japanese into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. What should we do and how should we do it? Well, they dropped the modus vivendi, calling for a 90-day cooling-off period with Japan, and submitted another ultimatum to Japan instead. This one was styled by the Army Pearl Harbor Board as the document that touched the button that started the war. In pertinent part, the fifth warning to Japan on November 26, 1941, in summation, told the Japanese to get out of China or else. As we now know, the first two iterations of this warning were written by Soviet spy Harry Dexter White. Writing years later, British Ambassador to Japan Robert Craigie said that President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull were fully conscious of what they were doing when they rejected the modus vivendi and knew that it would precipitate hostilities with Japan. President Roosevelt, when he read Craigie's report, was aghast and scribbled this note across Craigie's report. Craigie's report, is a very strange document and one which should be kept most scrupulously secret. November 29, 1941, another purple magic. German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, quoting Hitler to Ambassador Baron Oshima, and Oshima reporting that back to Tokyo. Should Japan become engaged in a war against the United States, Germany, of course, would join the war immediately. There is absolutely no possibility of Germany's entering into a separate peace with the United States under such circumstances. The Führer is determined on that point. December 1st, 1941, President Roosevelt himself directs that the following be done as soon as possible. This is a dispatch relaying the President's direct orders that 3 small ships be prepared to appear to be United States warships commanded by a United States naval officer, manned with a gun, and directed to sail between Cameron Bay and Cape St. Jacques, where the Japanese fleet was expected to be. Admiral Hart, the Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines, said this about the President's 3 small ships scheme, that it risked personnel to no purpose whatsoever. Does Admiral Hart's assessment that FDR's 3 small ship scheme risked personnel to no purpose whatsoever prompt the question, what then was the purpose? December 8, 1941. This purple magic dispatch was sent and translated the next day, before Germany had declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941. Again, Ribbentrop told Baron Oshima that on the morning of December 8th, Hitler issued orders to the entire German Navy to attack American ships whenever and wherever they met. It's time to hear some opinion. Captain W.D. Pulliston, former director of Naval Intelligence, had this to say in 1955. Admiral Kimmel was unjustly sacrificed with General Short, the head of the Army Hawaiian Command, to shield the shortcomings of President Roosevelt and his high command in Washington, who, as Secretary of War Stimson has revealed, sought to entice Japan into striking the first blow. Vice Admiral Bellinger, Naval Aviation legend and former Chief of Staff to Chief of Naval Operations Ernest King. The Pearl Harbor attack was a deep-dyed, deliberate plan to get this country into war with Japan and Germany by needling the Japanese into making the first war move. Roosevelt and his cohorts criminally failed to keep Admiral Kimmel informed of information that was available. Information that the simplest mind would have known was of vital importance to the protection of the Pacific Fleet. Edward Miller, historian and author of Bankrupting the Enemy and War Plan Orange, had this to say: the U.S. forced Japan into bankruptcy to deter its aggression. July 1941, President Roosevelt froze the money to bring Japan to its senses, not its knees. But FDR's intentions were thwarted by bureaucrats determined to deny Japan the dollars needed for survival. Who could those bureaucrats have actually been working for? The deprivations facing the Japanese people as a result buttressed Japan's choice of war at Pearl Harbor. The British weigh in. No reasonably informed person can now believe that Japan made a villainous, unexpected attack on the United States. An attack was not only fully expected, but was actually desired. It is beyond doubt that President Roosevelt wanted to get his country into the war, but for political reasons was most anxious to ensure that the first act of hostility came from the other side, for which reason he caused increasing pressure to be put on the Japanese to a point that no self-respecting nation could endure without resort to arms. Japan was meant by the American president to attack the United States. Oliver Littleton, British Minister of Production in 1944, had this to say: Japan was provoked into attacking America at Pearl Harbor. It is a travesty of history to say that America was forced into the war. I'll end with this. Winston Churchill, writing in 1931, there are many kinds of maneuvers in war, some only of which take place on the battlefield. The maneuver which brings an ally into the field is as serviceable as that which wins a great battle. This could just as easily have been written by Marshal Stalin. That concludes my remarks this evening. Thank you very, very much for your kind attention. I stand ready for your questions. Let's have some fun.
Did.